To all our members and to our guests, thank you for joining us today. First of all, we hope you and your families are all doing well, staying safe and healthy in these tumultuous times. I'm Miriam Ellman. I know many of you. I'm an associate professor at Syracuse University and the executive director of AEN, the Academic Engagement Network. And for those of you who are not familiar with AEN, we are an educational nonprofit. We are committed to fostering a robust and rigorous study and discourse about Jewish identity and the Jewish experience in the American Academy. We're committed to fostering academic exchange and to building bridges across difference. And as such, we are deeply opposed to academic boycotts. And we work to advance academic freedom and campus-free expression. Increasingly, we are also engaged with partner organizations to combat campus anti-Semitism. We have close to 850 members across all disciplines and ranks, and they work and teach at over 250 US campuses. Today, I want to thank two of those members, Ellen Kaplan at Smith College and Michael Saenger at Southwestern University, for organizing today's event. Ellen chairs AEN's interest group for faculty in the Northeast, and Michael chairs our section for faculty in the humanities. And they're among the 12 thematic, disciplinary, and geographic groups that we've recently formed at AEN. We're really delighted at how well these groups are working out. And today's event is really an excellent example of the terrific programming that's in store for the rest of the semester. Before I turn the floor over to Ellen, I just want to give a quick shout out to Spencer Kent and to Trey Meehan. They're on the call. Spencer is AN Senior Associate for Membership, and Trey is our digital and data operations manager. And Trey and Spencer, if you could just wave to everyone. To get these kinds of programs organized to facilitate all the back office and the tech components, really grateful to Spencer and Trey for facilitating that and today's program. Ellen and Michael and Justin and Varid, we really are looking forward to learning from you this afternoon. And Ellen, the floor is yours.
Got it. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you, Miriam, and thank you all for coming. As Michael and I put this panel together, we found that we have a lot in common, and our work in theater and in humanities, our commitment to AEN. And lately, we discussed Dara Horn's recent book, People Love Dead Jews. And as Michael says, we are fortified by Horn's urgent call to rethink how we engage with Jewish representation and the literary history of anti-Semitism. Our panelists broadly share an awareness of false security, of the need to resist efforts to domesticate literary and cultural history. In that sense, we feel that we practice defiant readings of Jewishness from texts past and present, and consider what that means for the future. I want to introduce now Michael Saenger, who will go first. He's speaking, his title is The Shylock Trap and the Academic Jew. Michael is Associate Professor of English at Southwestern University. He has written many articles on Renaissance literature, and his most recent book is Shakespeare and the French Borders of English. Michael?
Thank you, Ellen, and it's been a genuine pleasure working with you to set this up. Okay, so Shylock is, can people hear me? Can I just make sure I get an indication that, that we're okay? Okay, okay, good. I'm just making sure. Shylock is both a magnet and a trap for Jewish Shakespeareans. We are occasionally approached by Jewish friends and asked, is it true that Shakespeare was anti-Semitic? This question is directed at us because we are Shakespeareans, but also because we are Jewish. So we are understood to be both knowledgeable and trustworthy. I once wavered and temporized. Now I simply say yes. Does it matter? It matters a lot. Shakespeare's moral status is prime real estate in Western culture, and the discussion of the play has become a proxy for the question of whether anti-Semitism is real and whether Israel is legitimate. The debate epitomizes Dara Horn's suggestion that the modern reception of Jewish loss repeats patterns of anti-Semitism that it declares itself to memorialize. The Merchant of Venice is a comedy that features a cross-dressing heroine, Portia, who judges a Jew to be a vengeful legalist and punishes him with dispossession and forced conversion. She wins a husband. It's a happy comedy. Shakespeareans climb a mountain of scholarships before speaking. We begin with a series of caveats. Shylock is at times sympathetic. He can be rendered more so when acted ethically. The play has been appropriated by Yiddish and Israeli theater. It need not be staged as an anti-Semitic comedy, but can be framed as a drama about anti-Semitism. Every caveat has a caveat. This is the kind of Talmudic thinking that helps to explain why there are more Jews at many Shakespeare conferences than at synagogues. All of the qualifiers in the previous paragraph meet objections. Anti-Semitism was baked into the culture of Shakespeare's England. Shylock's sympathetic moments are followed by revelations where his repulsiveness is clear and undeniably Jewish in a pejorative sense. Moreover, why do we go to all the effort to rehabilitate the play and to make it mean and do something other than what it was written to mean and do? To serve a dead poet? To find our image in Shakespeare's face? To placate a modern culture that continues to normalize anti-Semitism? Are we, as Shakespeare's apologists, more biased than Portia, who presides over the judgment of the Jew in the fictional play? Compounding these theoretical concerns, there are others that can only be called somatic. As Jews, we are at times asked to speak in certain delimited academic roles, and so to perform the function of a physical palliative against any accusation of an anti-Semitic panel, performance, or conference. Of course, other ethnic minorities have similar experiences. We are concomitantly excised from positions where our presence might reify Jewish identity or problematize efforts to dismiss concerns about anti-Semitism. Let me return to the play now. Like many romantic comedies, it contains a villain whom the protagonists must outwit in order to realize their love. Bassanio is a dashing Venetian who wants to court the rich but lonely Portia. In order to do so, he must borrow money from a friend who must borrow that money from a Jew. That transaction is accomplished with a bond that stipulates a pound of flesh to be extracted from the debtor in the event of default. The villain is Shylock, who mixes with the Christians of Venice, in the street, in the economy, and ultimately in the courtroom. He pursues a pound of flesh from a Christian in the middle of a Venetian courtroom in place of money. It is, for Shylock, all about the Benjamins. That attempt at violence reenacts the blood guilt by which medieval Jews were stigmatized, an echo of the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus. Portia outwits the Jew, leaving him at the mercy of the court with two options, death or a conversion to Christianity. The pivotal scene thus begins as a lawsuit and then becomes a criminal trial with a theological resolution. The first phase is taken as evidence for the second. The Jew never had a chance, but while we may mourn his defeat, Shakespeare's audience celebrated his erasure. And through that erasure, the erasure of the Jew in general. Anti-Semitism promotes the notion that Judaism is to be valued for its history, its texts, and its ancestral link to Christianity, but not for its life and its continued futurity, which may help to explain the particular venom directed against Jewish women and children. And so we move from judging Shylock to judging Shakespeare. Did Shakespeare hate Jews? Prominent Jews have taken opposing positions on that question, On the one side, Harold Bloom, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Jacques Derrida have said that the play is anti-Semitic, whereas Stephen Greenblatt and Abraham Oz have tried to redeem Shylock. I side with the first group, but here I want to address this from a different angle. I want to talk about the body of the academic Jew. At one point in my graduate study, a Jewish professor led a discussion on the play and mediated admirably between opposing sides, between students in Ginsburg's camp and students in Greenblatt's. After the class, I walked with her back to her office, and once there, sotto voce, she said, "Of course it's anti-Semitic." I would like to focus on that stage whisper and everything it coded and contained. Scholarly debates need nuance, and I do not question the motives of those Jews who drain the horror that to me is obvious from the play. However, since graduate school, I have seen enough to give me pause. At the 2017 European Shakespeare Conference in Gdansk, during a time shortly after Poland criminalized certain discussions of anti-Semitism, Diana Henderson seemed to make a point of bluntly saying that the play is anti-Semitic in her plenary talk. The 2019 Shakespeare Association of America conference was scheduled to coincide with Passover, so one had to choose whether one was Jewish or Shakespearean. My synagogue was set on fire this past November, and my son was, at a liberal arts college, told that Zionism is racism, a remark that was prompted by nothing other than the fact that he is a Jew. While doing academic research in my own college library, I found a book on Shakespeare that, in an apparent slip of the scholarly tongue, confused Shylock, a fictional literary character, with Israel, a country that has people in it. I have considered writing a traditional book on the topic entitled something like The Monster in the Library, The Continuing Life of Jew Hate in Literary Analysis in College Life, but I have written enough books to hesitate, wary of what it would do to my spirit to wrestle with such a monster. Wary also of Varid Weiss's dictum that we must not be Jews in such a way that we are anti-Semites, to the exclusion of the love and joy, the life Judaism gives us. I will therefore conclude with a plea that we find new paths at physical and rhetorical clarity. Shylock never stands on the warmth and plenitude of his faith, so he never really stands at all. My professor did, though perhaps the time for a stage whisper has passed. That's it for me. And now I will introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Varid Weiss. Dr. Weiss is the Israel Institute Teaching Fellow at Sonoma State University. Her fields of interest include Israeli literature, cinema and television, speculative literature, spatiality, and narrative empathy. And her paper today is entitled Made for Rejection, Racial Otherness, and Narrative Empathy in the Wondrous Deeds of the Maharal of Prague by Yudl, Rosenberg, and Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can all see that. So thank you for that kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this important webinar. So while the title of the talk itself could take the entire 10 minutes, it is important to note we are discussing this particular adaptation of the Golem myth by Rosenberg and referring to Wollstonecraft Shelley's Frankenstein because both have had numerous literary and cinematic adaptations. So in both narratives, a man creates a humanoid creature without a woman, thereby subverting the natural order of human productivity and creating a new race. So these are quintessential texts about racism. And now, the Golem is an integral part of Jewish tradition, and the Golem has a place within Judaism as an affirmation of faith and piety. Rosenberg's 1909 adaptation of the myth attributes the creation of the Golem to the Maharal of Prague, who was the head rabbi of the Jews in Prague during the latter half of the 16th century. Gershom Scholem accurately recognized Rosenberg's adaptation of the golem myth as a departure from previous narratives and labeled it modern. An important aspect of Rosenberg's modernity stems from the ways he utilizes the golem in the context of threats of a resurgence of anti-Semitism. Now, what I argue is that in both texts, the locations of the creatures are spatial metaphors for marginalization and exclusion based on racism, and furthermore, that these spatial metaphors of exclusion interplay with levels and kinds of narrative empathy. So first, to commence this brief discussion, I want to share a brief outline of the basic comparison between the two creatures. So both are man-made humanoid creatures, and this is really where the similarities make way for differences, because the golem is made of clay and the creature of exhumed body parts. The golem is made as a representation of piety, and the creature is made as an act of defiance. The golem is made for protection, and the creature is made to improve mankind. The golem represents the Jewish community, and the creature represents the colonized other. The golem is named and the creature is nameless, and most importantly, arguably, the golem is mute and the creature is painfully eloquent. We'll see that in a minute. So, adding to a very large body of research on golem and Frankenstein, the following reading focuses on the ways in which the setting in both texts articulates spatial metaphors that illuminate tensions between otherness and narrative empathy. And so for the following analysis, we should note the difference between pity or sympathy and empathy, or feeling with someone. So I'm basing this on Suzanne Kien's articulation of these ideas. So before sharing a couple of short segments that will illustrate my argument, I would like to very briefly outline the comparison of the two texts in the context of spatiality and narrative empathy. So I'm interested in where things happen and how the narrative is told and experienced. So whereas the golem is located in the home of the Maharal, the creature is forever homeless. And while the golem is embraced by the community and his presence is regulated with elaborate rules and regulations, similar to rules and regulations pertaining to a disabled person, the creature is rejected and rebellious, becomes a horrible criminal, a murderer. And finally, whereas the golem induces ambivalence and pity, the creature invites ambivalence and empathy. So following the creature's initial rejection, it flees to the forest near Ingolstadt. So Frankenstein creates this creature and then rejects him horribly. And then the creature travels across Europe until eventually it attempts to find its place on Earth and is chased all the way to the North, which would be a metonymy to the end of the world at the time. Since the creature yearns for communal comfort, it leaves the forest near Ingolstadt, seeking society, which is a significant move in the context of the reader's empathy. As the creature emerges from the forest, it is battered and expelled by the villagers, and then it finds refuge in a hovel adjoining the de Lacy's cottage. So it's a family, we can talk about them later if there's time. And then the readers join the creature as it becomes the invisible servant of the de Lacys, and the readers accompany the monster's encounter with language, which, as Peter Book's notes, is, quote, tied to human love and patterns of kinship and relation, end quote. However, even though it gains linguistic abilities, the creature is rejected by society due to its racial otherness. And I want to share a short segment. And so this is after the creature has gained linguistic abilities, and it confronts Frankenstein, asking him to acknowledge its wretched solitude and create a mate for him. And he says, "How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favourable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent, my soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. So the creature's loneliness is represented through the spatiality of the desert mountains and dreary glaciers. And the creature's remarkable eloquence is significant because it allows Wollstonecraft Shelley to clearly articulate the creature's plea. And so the readers hear the creature's plight along with Frankenstein and, like him, feel empathy for the creature as they understand its reasons and motivations. And so when Frankenstein agrees to create a mate for the creature, the readers also understand and follow the full process of horror as they too realize the ramifications of this endeavor. So the dissonance between the creature's painfully human articulation of its loneliness and its inhumanity leaves the readers feeling confused and an ambivalent feeling as they form profound empathy for the creature, even while they recognize its inhumanity both as a racial other and as a murderer. Now, conversely, in spite of its racial otherness, the golem is accepted into the Jewish community, and this happens because the Maharal decrees so. So the explanation the Maharal gives for the appearance of the golem in his household is that he came across a mute simpleton on his way to prayer, felt sorry for him, and took him home as a second shamash. A shamash is like a domestic responsible for the maintenance of the synagogue and other communal facilities. So the shamash is an integral, albeit socially lowly member of the community, and the golem then is depicted as a fool and simpleton, and these characteristics are associated with its spatial location within the household. And this is the second segment I want us to look at. And because the golem always sat at a corner of the courtroom at the edge of the table, resting his head on his hands, looking indeed like an unfinished vessel, lacking wisdom and understanding nothing, and not worrying about a thing under the sun, the people called him Yossele the Golem, while some named him Yossele the Mute. So the golem is the tolerated, though taunted, silent other. It is treated as a mute and is an acceptable part of the community. So the golem has clear judicial rulings within the Jewish tradition and is treated much like a mute or neurodiverse person would have been at the time. And the depiction of the golem as mute resonates with Jewish tradition regarding otherness, diversity, and inclusivity. So over the years, Jewish community has produced elaborate rules and regulations regarding the various others within it, and the text suggests the Maharal used the Jewish social apparatus so that the golem is accepted as a mute person. As Ephraim Schornsteiner explains, since congenital deafness was thought to impair certain acquired cognitive skills, it was perceived as disruptive of the development of the mind, which defines the legal and religious persona. So deaf people were often labeled as deaf and dumb, and therefore fell under the legal definition of the idiot who requires the legal guardianship of an adult. So the golem is treated by the Jewish religious apparatus almost as a deaf or non-speaking person. And so the comparison of Frankenstein and Golem reveals the fundamental difference in the function of the racial other in these texts as an identity-creating metaphor. In the British text, the racial other is forever a fugitive, persecuted and rejected, an abomination. While in the Jewish narrative, the other is a part of society, regulated and controlled under the reign of God. Both Frankenstein's creature and the golem are racial others. However, the difference between the place allotted to them is a reflection of the two cultures' relationship to the other. And then the locations of the creatures in the text can be perceived as reflections of the locations of self and other in the two cultures. While in both narratives the creatures are located on the margins of society, one is accepted and the other is rejected, and consequently, one might expect that the readers would form more narrative empathy towards the golem as it is an accepted part of the narrative's community. However, in spite of spatial proximity and liminal social acceptability, the linguistic barrier and the mythological underpinnings complicate the formation of narrative empathy. And then the inverted correlation between spatial marginalization of the creatures and the formation of narrative empathy in the two texts highlight the complexities of perception of self and other. If reading literature can help readers work through certain thought process, then perhaps reading the ways Frankenstein and Gollum function in the context of racism and anti-Semitism might shed light upon the significance of processes of empathy in these narratives that suggest alternatives to the ways we perceive and conceptualize tensions between self and other. And furthermore, and importantly for our discussion, if the golem is a metaphor for the Jew, then we need to ensure it does not remain mute. So my point is that to foster empathy, it is not enough to have Judaic studies programs on campus. We need to actively reach out to the local communities and engage in discussions about Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Varid. It's a pleasure listening to that. And our next speaker is Justin Cammy. Justin Cammy is Professor of World Literatures and Chair of the program in Jewish Studies at Smith College. He is the translator and editor of Abraham Sutzkever's From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, published by McGill Queens in 2021.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially not only being with my fellow panelists, but also seeing some old friends there. I particularly want to shout out to Jim Wald at Hampshire and Lori Lefkowitz and Donna Devine, who I haven't had a chance to see in person in quite some time. I'm going to be a little bit more discursive. Those were beautifully crafted papers, and really start out with the move from my undergraduate degree that was in politics to my graduate degree that was in literature and cultural studies. And I was convinced in taking just an elective course when I was an undergraduate and growing rather frustrated with the inability of political science to actually predict anything, that in a well-conceived work, whether that be a work of art or a film or a novel that is a well-conceived piece of artistry, you have almost everything that the Academy tries to balkanize and tear apart. You have literature, you have aesthetics, you have language, you have psychology, you have history, you have political motivation, you have philosophy and history of ideas, you have environment, you have gender and sexuality and class and economics and love and war. And really what I'm trying to do in my work is to bring those two things together. My initial interest in the political actor and I guess my more mature interest in how works of art can reflect certain types of political commitments. And that's why very early on when I arrived at Smith, I started teaching a course called Literature and Zionism to provide students perhaps with a different way of thinking about this topic than through the angle necessarily of government departments or history departments. And I think especially when I teach this class, I always start with George Eliot's Daniel Deronda of 1876. And this is quite an interesting choice because of course Deronda is not a Zionist. Some have called her a proto-Zionist, but she anticipates Zionism. And of course, George Eliot is also not a Jew. And this novel is a novel of not only class and nation, and especially an examination of Victorian England, but I suggest to my students an examination of the power of ideas in a work of art and how really human beings and readers can be motivated to act in and through history by ideas. It was not an uncontroversial book, as I'm sure many of you know. Irving Howe, the great American critic, suggested that Eliot had to resist a lot of criticism of this novel from those who thought that the Jewish parts detracted from the English parts, and suggested to her that perhaps the Jewish narrative and plots should be excised in favor of the plot that focused more on Gwendolyn Harleth and her romances and struggles. But in Eliot's journal, we know that she writes that, quote, "I meant everything to be related to everything else. That is, there can be no English part without a Jewish part, and there can be no Jewish part without an English part. So why her interest in the Jews other than the very personal relationships that she had? Well, one could argue, as Howe and others have done, that Daniel Deronda as a novel really tries to establish Deronda as a counter myth to Fagin, to Dickens' Fagin, which of course is the other major 19th century Jewish figure, here established as a thief, a mentor of thieves, and really becomes a dominant myth in the English imagination. From the very beginning, we see in Daniel Deronda this effort to enshrine this deracinated, adopted son who will eventually discover his Jewishness, and to establish through him a model of Jewish nobility. And in that, the novel brings the national, I think, back into the definition of the Jews. I think this is critically important, that whereas the Jews before were racially defined or religiously defined, Daniel Deronda allows for a discussion of national ideas at the heart of a major Victorian novel. And this troubled people like Henry James, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, all of whom wrote about the book or directly to George Eliot complaining about this. And I think the central question of the novel is also still the central question of our own moment, and that is whether the Jews are truly assimilable, whether the Jews can truly assimilate and through assimilation be treated as equals, as a minority in majoritarian societies, or whether a counter model, or at least another model, needs to be available. And we see this all over the novel from the very beginning. When there's not even a Jewish character being talked about, we have Gwendolyn Harleth talking about, quote, the importance of being rooted in a native land. Why is land important? Because land is one of the constituent elements in memory. And slowly as the novel develops, we see that Daniel Deronda begins to resist the efforts of his adoptive father to train him to be an English gentleman. He says at one point, I want to be an Englishman, but I also want to understand other points of view. And I want to get rid of merely English attitudes in my studies. And he's always marked as foreign throughout the novel, whether that be because of his complexion or whether that be because of his interests. Throughout, whenever he meets a new character, he's marked as other, even though he's a quintessential English gentleman at this point. And the real turning point of the novel, for those who read it, occurs when he rescues a drowning young woman who throws herself into the Thames, a girl by the name of Mira, who tells him after she's been rescued, I have nowhere to go, nobody belonging to me in all of this land. So this becomes the quintessential homeless condition, or the quintessential wandering Jew. And for Daniel, as he learns more about her Jewishness and also about her pride in being Jewish, it occurs to him that he had never thought of Jews as actually still existing. They had always occurred to him as being sort of these antiquated beings, these repugnant beings to him. And like his neighbors, he says that they were some type of eccentric, fossilized beings. And this becomes the moment of Daniel's search, of Daniel's awakening. He is drawn to Jewish neighborhoods. Eventually, he's invited to a Sabbath dinner where he meets a neo-prophetic figure. This figure is also someone who happens to be a repairer of timepieces. And I think this is a really interesting moment, that sort of there's a problem with the times, and there's someone who needs to repair the times in order to put order back into the world. And it's this figure who beseeches Daniel to be not only a hand to me, but a soul, to believe in my belief, to be moved by my reasons, to see my hopes, to be able to experience vision. So we have here Daniel, who's in search perhaps of a biological father, of origins, and this man that he encounters, Mordecai, who's in search of some type of spiritual son. And I would argue that all of this comes about in an extraordinary chapter, chapter number 42, where you actually have a staged debate at a pub known as the Hand and Banner, where they actually argue about the power of nationhood, the power of nationalism, the future of Europe, whether that be Europe as a constellation of nations acting independently, but also in concert, or whether those ideas are entirely out of favor, and progress will be bringing one to a stage where there doesn't need to be such a thing as a nation anymore. But the narrator comments at the end of that really wonderful debate, it is as though they had come together to hear the blowing of a shofar. So this is George Eliot, right? It is as though they had come together to hear the blowing of a ram's horn. And this, I think, is an extraordinary moment for the English novel, for the Victorian novel, to have this type of idea, to have this type of character, where who at the end of the book argues confidently that I am possessed with the idea of restoring political existence to my people, of making them a nation again, of giving them a national center, such as the English have. This is the task that presents itself to me as a duty. So notice here that Daniel Deronda anticipates Achad Ha'am, and Achad Ha'am's idea of a spiritual center, by certainly several decades. And his choice at the end of the novel essentially suggests that perhaps England is not the promised land to all of its inhabitants. Perhaps Daniel represents a new type of nobility, not a nobility that is modeled alongside class and alongside English so-called blood, but a nobility of a different sort. So many have argued, and I want to stop here, that Eliot's novel disrupts and in fact challenges the English foundations of the Victorian novel. I agree with this, but I want to also acknowledge, at least out there, that there are both philo-Semitic and possibly anti-Semitic readings of the text, right? On the one hand, one can say what an amazing moment to have this extraordinary Jewish character written by George Eliot, and not only Deronda, but other extraordinary Jewish characters in the text. On the other hand, one must recognize that Deronda is written out of the future of England by actually sending him to the East. So if that could be read as Eliot's vision, perhaps that is something that is a little bit more sobering than the way I've read the book or suggested the book could be read so far. So with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Our speaker is back to where we started, Ellen Kaplan. Ellen Kaplan is the Smith College Professor of Theater, Director, Playwright. Her most recent work is Testimonies, a play based on interviews with Yazidi women in the Kurdish region of Iraq. Her volume, Chasing the Demons on Theater and Social Trauma, will be published by Routledge in 2022. And her paper today is entitled Old Wine in New Bottles, Contesting Jewish Identity on the 21st Century American Stage.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This has been so the threads that come together and overlap. Just as an aside to say, I'm reading now a novel called La Madre de Frankenstein, which is set in Franco's Spain and looks at difference and otherness in everything from Jews to mute to mentally ill. And it's just it's exciting to hear all these connections. Okay, so for me. Okay, Alicante, which is on the southeast coast of Spain, today has a very tiny Jewish community, mostly descendants of Sephardic Jews who were kicked out in 1492, allowed to claim citizenship in 2015. That was the year that Stephen Greenblatt, whom Michael mentioned, a renowned Shakespeare scholar, saw The Mystery of Elche, which is a 13th century play still performed annually in Alicante. In the play, a young boy is dressed as the Virgin and paraded through the town to the church, where the boy slips under he magically slips away and is replaced by a life-size statue of the Virgin, which is now a corpse. And this statue, this corpse, is duly attacked by a crowd of Jews wearing talit and yarmulkes and singing O Deo Adonai. When the Jews reach the body, a miracle occurs. The rabbi's hands are paralyzed, the Jews fall to their knees, they convert, and they're baptized. Greenblatt writes then of another play, the 15th century play of the Sacrament, which is about a rich Jew who pays a Christian merchant to steal the Eucharist. And then Jews attack the host to show that Christian belief is false because they believe in a cake. But when Jews stab the host, it bleeds like Jesus. It sort of reenacts the crucifixion. The Jews fall to their knees, they repent and convert. The community is cleansed, like the figure of the blind synagogos, right? Jews are blind to truth, they are stubborn, and they separate themselves from this truth by choice. Okay. We could go, the Jews on the medieval stage were red-wigged and presented like Satan, and historically were seen as the embodiment of evil. Representation evolves. Modern stereotypes are much subtler for the most part. Anti-Semitic tropes are milder, veiled, coded, but they're powerful. We internalize stereotype. They embed themselves within us like shrapnel. They contribute, I'm saying, to an accelerating erosion of Jewish identity. As we struggle with assimilation, erasure, disappearance, it's useful to examine the new faces of old antipathies. So I'm in theater, and theater, I maintain, is a site of struggle and definition always. Contemporary Jewish American plays ask, what does it mean to be a Jew now? When religion is ascribed, but a choice and opportunities for assimilation abound. So who are we as hyphenated Americans? Many contemporary plays probe schisms in Jewish American identity, the left-right schism, religious, secular, atheist, Zionist, anti-Zionist, the consequences of assimilation, the anxieties of identity, right? Success, the Boyarans say, success has led to deculturation, an accelerating erosion of our identity. And many contemporary Jews in America certainly are in positions of privilege, but those, as we've seen and are seeing, are precarious positions. So I want to talk about a couple of 20th century American plays with a little detour into older 20th century plays. Tony Kushner, who's kind of the dean of American theater, says that assimilation is a false promise predicated on abandoning our identity as Jews. And his plays, which kind of offer a kind of Talmudic debate about ethics, sexual, racial, cultural, political identities, and an exploration of what this means. I wrote an essay called Unruly Difference, because there are differences in conceptions of Judaism, obviously, that Kushner and many others embrace and writes about. What I want to say is his influence on Jewish American writers can't be overstated. Just a brief review, starting say in the 30s with Clifford Odette's Awake and Sing, right, which focuses on a 21-year-old Ralph Berger, inspired by his grandfather Jacob's socialism. And ultimately he escapes his family's cramped, shabby Jewish neighborhood and leaves this family behind, along with his Jewish identity. By the 50s on American stages, Jews seemed to disappear. There was nothing overtly Jewish about the Lomans. Later plays like Early Manna, everyone wants to melt into the American honeypot. Of course, you have Fiddler, which is a nostalgia for a world that no longer exists, but Sondheim, Pinter, Stoppard, they're all Jews, but they're invisible Jews. By the 80s and 90s, I'm going to look at, just for a moment, Wendy Wasserstein's Sisters Rosenzweig. Sarah Good, the central character, is waspier than wasp. She's a Jew who's completely rejected her Jewish identity. And what we see in the play is ambivalence, rejection, a nostalgia, maybe re-engagement, but essentially Jewish cultural integrity is more precarious than ever. So the question is, why is any character Jew? Well, stereotypes make difference visible to reinforce hierarchy. The stage Jew is this character, just as in Elche, a despicable Jew, refuses the comfort of Christianity. Stereotypes I maintain, contain implicit narratives, tropes that create norms. The bel juive, the yenta, the schlemiel who spills the soup, the schlemazel that the soup is spilled on, the greedy Jew, the effeminate Jew, cowardly, unmanly, worships money, stingy, greedy. We are famous comedians, right? Self-deprecating humor is great, but it also internalizes self-hatred. Hannah Gadsby said, when you exist on the margins, self-deprecation isn't humility, it's humiliation. I want to focus, if I could, on Broadway's magnificent Lehman trilogy, which brings to mind St. Jerome, who said, a man who is a merchant can never please God. Well, the Lehmans are uber capitalists, and they're Jews without God. This play, this extravaganza, and it's magnificent, is about the Lehman family and about global finance. Lehman's Chapter 11, filing in 2008, was the biggest in US history. Subprime mortgage meltdown, global financial crisis, right? So here's the story. In 1844, Henry, née Chaim, left Bavaria to open a dry goods store in Montgomery, Alabama, selling seersucker and chintz. His brothers join him, and as America is becoming an industrial economy. They started, the Lehmans, with a small store, taking payment in raw cotton, which they sold to factories for processing. And soon they became large-scale cotton brokers. They borrowed money after the Civil War from Alabama's governor, and ultimately invested and created what became the Cotton Exchange. They relocated to New York and created other commodity exchanges, sugar, coal, oil, and ultimately the stock exchange. Okay. They were middlemen, connecting producers with consumers, resources with markets, investors with entrepreneurs. In 1901, Philip Lehman took the company into investment banking. Ultimately, the company went to Bobby Lehman, one of the grandsons. He's the last Lehman. He dies in 1969 after running it for 44 years. And the play, he dances into the twist, into eternity. And after his death, the CEO passes outside the family. The point is, they are middlemen. When Mayer proposes marriage, the girl's father asks what he does for a living. He says, we're right in the middle, Mr. Nugas. What sort of job is that, being in the middle? It's an occupation that doesn't yet exist. We're the ones who are starting it. He goes on to say, first, when we were in business, people gave us money and we gave something in exchange. Now that we're a bank, people give us money just the same, but we give nothing in exchange. Using money to make money, lending, investing, is a prerequisite for the emergence of capitalism. Finance is despised. Life improved, but finance is despised. Populist William Jennings Bryan accused American bankers of crucifying mankind on a cross of gold. Everything is a commodity, the price. Now, Marx, who was born in 1818, checking my time, which was 3 years before Chaim Lehman was born, in 1844, Marx wrote on the Jewish question, arguing that abolishing Judaism is a prerequisite for the redemption of the world. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. For Marx, Jews are a metaphor and money is a disease. Usury, profession of the Jews, is the basis for the rise of for the rise of capitalist economy. So when Philip Lehman says in the play, normal people use money just for buying, but those like us who have a bank use money to buy money, to sell money, to loan money, to exchange money. They say, the people on stage say, Baruch Hashem, as they say over and over when deals are consummated. At the end, they recite Kaddish for the dead bank, and it feels like for our country. The conflations of Judaism and capitalism. When Henry dies in 1855, they sat Shiva for full 7 days, then for 3 minutes, then finally for Bobby Lehman, 1 moment of silence. It's the classic Jewish critique. Jews are about contracts, legalisms, like Shylock, critique of capital, accumulation and materialism. I'll talk very, very briefly about If I Forget, which is another play that was on Broadway, which centers on Michael, a Jewish studies professor who writes a book, Forget the Holocaust, asserting that the Holocaust is used to justify immoral actions, and along with campaign contributions by rich Jews to justify Israel actions. And on Broadway, there were groans of recognition and despair, actually, concern. The audience, of course, is a New York, white, wealthy, mostly Jewish audience. And yet here we hear the Holocaust diminished through the mouth of a Jew. Briefly, because I realize I don't have much time, I will say Michael crosses the generational divide. His father helped to liberate the camps and speaks the language of obligation and responsibility. But Michael wants freedom from obligation, freedom from history, from religion, and from Israel. He says, we spent the entire 20th century trying to get away from that. And now look around, everybody on the Upper West Side is reading books on Kabbalah and kosher sex, whatever that is. And didn't we already have this conversation? Didn't we decide we're done with, spirits in the sky? Just to, I won't go into any more because I'm over time, but it asks the question ultimately, what are we to inherit? The play turns on whether they sell the store or not that belongs to his father. What do we bring forward? What do we carry into the future? How do we stay Jews? There's a play called Bad Jews, in which three siblings fight over grandpa's chai. Grandpa passed away. The youngest doesn't speak. The middle one is hyper-focused on being Jewish, but she's insufferable and belligerent and physically repulsive. And Liam, the oldest, gives the chai to his blonde Gentile fiance. So what gets passed down? I will end. The last thing I'm going to say is that I have a student, though, who wrote a play about her Zadie. She's an excellent playwright. She's writing about Yiddishkeit, about her love for tradition, her heritage. And in a way, she's saying her past, our past is our future, which is kind of exciting. I think I must be at 10 minutes, so I assume that I'm going to end. So thank you. Now.
Very much, Ellen. So I think we're open for questions and responses, if anyone has.
Trey, we're gonna hope that you are handling whatever questions come, and we're close to time, but I can stay a few minutes later if anybody else wants to. Any questions? I'll finish my talk.
It was all so clear, there are no questions.
That must be it.
Jim Wald, you must have a question. You always have a question.
Hi. Hi there.
I mean, sort of, Justin. Actually, I was thinking about your course too, because I very much enjoyed the talk and the focus on one particular canonical text. I guess one of my questions, maybe in the context of this discussion, is how is this course received on campus? I mean, obviously, knowing you, the title is somewhat deliberately provocative. You could have framed it in many different ways. Has there been pushback against it? What kind of students take the course? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I deliberately have this course as a first-year seminar before the students are socialized. So I have a totally different type of student who would take my course on, let's say, the history of Israel that would take a course like this. They don't really know what they're getting into. And in many cases, it's their second or third choice because they can't get into other first-year seminars. So they're sort of stuck with the topic. And we, I mean, I think the important thing is that we take literature seriously, and we also take ideas seriously, and that the novels I choose provide a huge diversity of opinion on this question. So it's not only something like Deronda, and it's not only Israeli authors, and it's not only American authors, but also Palestinian authors. There's a way for them to read quite broadly. But you're right. Some people start to suspect that there's a motive, an ulterior motive behind the course. And we try to talk about that as openly as we can. So far, I think I've offered it 6 times, and it's been quite successful.
Do you feel that introducing students to this historical version of Jewish otherness and anti-Semitism in Europe helps give them some perspective on contemporary contemporary issues or contemporary politics, or not, or it's just nice but not relevant?
I'll let one of the other panelists take that.
I want to, it's sort of obliquely responding to that, because this is a huge question I teach as well, where the students, in that play that I was mentioning, if I forget, he says, Michael, this professor says, we're white people now, we're respectable, we're nothing at all. And that, I've got to say, is what I just taught a first year seminar, and I had one student tell me she cried in the bathroom for half an hour after she read a different play, because all her Jewish family, her entire heritage is gone. That she said, my name is the only thing Jewish about my family. I went to Hebrew school. My siblings didn't. We do nothing. And being nothing at all, being uncool, which I'm delighted to be, but I think that it's hard for our students to find what is relevant to them about being Jewish. I feel like it's evaporating. So I don't know if that's quite an answer to Carol, but
I was thinking more in terms of non-Jewish students who take this, whose opinions on Zionism and the Middle East may have been formed or not have been formed before they come to campus. And, yeah, please.
I can contribute. So as the Israel Institute Teaching Fellow, I teach courses about Israel, and I teach Introduction to Hebrew Literature, and many times, many of my students, like Justin's, didn't really intend to take this course, but they had to because it qualifies for GE or it fit the schedule. And I'm delighted when that happens, because then I get students who are not necessarily Jewish, and also, not necessarily in Judaic studies, had nothing to do, right? They study biomolecular studies, and it is quite heartwarming to see how they come either with absolutely no knowledge or with a certain negative bias. And as they read, we read in translation, but as they read Hebrew literature and Israeli literature, they are delighted to find this, rich, diverse culture. And so I've had really very good positive responses by a wonderful, diverse variety cohort.
Nice to know.
Well,
we're at time. We can, if there are no more questions, does anybody on the panel? I'm sorry, Michael, I interrupted you.
that's fine.
Does anybody else want to say anything? Yeah.
I just want to see if you're all planning to put these papers together as a special issue for a journal or as an edited book, because I think what you have to say is each of you together, the synergy across the different papers, the topics, the way you bring it to these texts to issues of today. Each of you did that, whether it's on campus, off campus. I think this would resonate, across multiple disciplines, certainly in the performance arts and the humanities, but I think across Jewish and Israel studies as well. I can almost see in my mind's eye a book prospectus for an edited volume. I think you may have people in the audience who might contribute a couple more papers.
Okay.
But I really do encourage you to think about next steps here. I found, it's not my field or my area, but I learned a lot, and I found ways in which it resonates to my work on Israel and on Zionism. And so I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea.
Me too. Michael, perhaps the panelists, we can talk about it. Anybody who's interested can send us an interest.
Yes.
That would be great.
Sure.
I think Ed has his hand up.
I
Yeah.
look forward to reading it. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the papers a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say my discipline is psychology. I'm retired now, so I'm not an active scholar, but I am working with Miriam and AEN on Jewish identity issues for psychologists in CAPS centers at universities. And as I've been listening to your presentations, it occurred to me that the struggle of Jewish identity is not just internal among Jews, but among people who have to characterize Jews in literature and art and so on, who may not be Jewish. And as you've articulated these various pieces in literature, it occurs to me that the relevance for some of the work that AEN is doing is that we ourselves have a multitude, a richness, which is both a blessing and a curse in terms of people relating to us as a people. And you've done a lovely job in sharing that in literature. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
All right. Well, I don't want to overstay our welcome. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm sure we'll all be in touch. Hopefully we can all meet in person before too long. Maybe in Jerusalem.
Next year.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all. Thank you so much.